Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. It is a big honor for me to start this spring 2024 online lecture series of the Inter-University Research Group on Tibet and the Himalayas, which is called in French Groupe de Recherche Inter-Université sur le Tibet et l'Himalaya, also known as GRITH. And the theme of the spring series is Tibet and Canada, Canada on Tibet. In this season, we feature 12 lectures of scholars either from Canada or currently based in Canada who are doing their research on Tibet. And today, our lecture series starts with an overview of Tibetan studies in Canada by Isabelle Henrion-Dourcy. And it is particularly moving for me that today, as of 27th of March, it is exactly 4 months that I'm here in Canada. And it was Isabelle, exactly 4 months ago, who met me at the airport in Montreal, who welcomed me at her house, who showed me around the city and introduced me to my colleagues at Laval University. And now I have this opportunity to introduce Isabelle's talk to you during the launch of the this spring season series. So I just want to say that I am beyond grateful for this beautiful blend of synchronicities or coincidences today that I owe to Isabelle. Because this whole shift of my studies here to Canada has happened due to her initiative, her vigorous efforts, and her relentless support of me on my way here. I'm also very grateful that Isabelle supported the very idea of this Pan-Canadian lecture series and enthusiastically navigated me in preparing the wonderful lineup of our upcoming speakers. And finally, I would like to thank the speakers who have agreed to be part of this spring 2024 lecture series. And now I give the floor to Isabelle, who is the founder of GRITH, who is the head of GRITH, and who is truly the perpetual engine of Tibetan studies for me in Canada. So please welcome Isabelle with her talk.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you. It's very endearing and very charming, but I think you're shedding too much light on me, as we will see during my talk. There is a lot actually being achieved in Tibetan studies in Canada, and I'm just a little insect or a little part of it. But you are right. It's really my joy to make it flourish and bring it into more light, so we are more aware of each other's work and probably see from there where we would like to go. So warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for tuning in from various parts of the world and Teshidele. So here, my talk is thought really as a teaser, if you will, as a way to set the table for the wonderful lineup of talks that we will have in the following 3 months. So it's really thought as a general overview of Tibetan studies in Canada. So what I aim to do here is to first propose or see how Tibet and Canada have intersected, have been in relation with one another. Well, of course, focusing mostly on academia. So who were the Canadians involved in Tibetan studies? Or who were the scholars working in Canada, not necessarily Canadians, on Tibetan studies? And then what about the Tibetan diaspora living here in Canada? How much has it influenced, nourished, fed the research done about Tibet in this country? And so my aim is really general, is to portray a little bit what has been achieved so far. And actually, I think my talk will be a little bit, maybe not superficial, but will cover a lot of horizontal ground I will cite a lot of names, and I won't really have time to go very deeply into each person's projects and skills. So I hope you don't mind, and I hope that the people I will portray won't feel too misrepresented by the way I will very briefly sketch their contributions. Um, I believe that every single part actually of this talk is worth a talk on its own. So I will first set the context, how Tibetan studies are the object of a lot of reflexive history at the moment. And then look at the past, see who were the Canadian travelers in pre-modern Tibet or pre-Chinese PRC takeover Tibet. Has there been any influence by Canadian Buddhists and sympathizers? What was the role of the Tibetan diaspora over here? And then look at the academic contributions before I set to conclude. So first, the context. Of course, the history of Tibetan studies has been heavily researched and documented in a few landmark studies about showing how much the Western imagination about Tibet, especially imagination about Buddhism and Buddhist practices, has shaped misunderstanding, distortion, misrepresentations about Tibet. And this has somehow also informed the construction of Tibetology or Tibetan studies as a field. So I have just shown you here some of the most important or landmark contributions, and here also with important articles by Tsering Shakya, Per Kuerna, or Claude Harpy, but also over the last 15 or 17 years or so, Tibetologists have started to reflect on the constitution of Tibetan studies in their own country. So what I aim to do here is set myself a little bit in the continuity of all of these scholars, and in a few months or so, try and actually write a little bit of the history of Tibetan studies in Canada. So here you see with a contribution on Poland, on Berlin, on Tibet, the emergence of Tibetan anthropologists from Tibet, on the United States, a second one on Tibetan Tibetology, on Norway. Again, you see here on Japan, a first contribution here on Australia, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Contemporary China. So the first three you see there are part of a specific special issue of Asian ethnicity. And again, Per Sørensen on Germany, again, Denmark, Paris, and a second contribution, a more recent one on Australia, and it's Italy, and then three contributions on Russia by two different Russian scholars. So you see there is a kind of zeitgeist or air du temps to reflect about national, so to speak, traditions of Tibetology and Tibetan studies. So I don't aim to answer what are the specific characteristics of Canadian Tibetan studies. I don't think we're there yet, but I aim to set a few items for us to think with. So as most of this literature has known, early travelers to Tibet have been contributors to understanding, but also misunderstanding Tibetans' ways of life. And so among the early travelers, well, early, so to speak, because Canadians are a little bit later than European or American travelers to Tibet. So we are talking here about the very end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. We have missionaries and one journalist. Researching the Canadian missionaries to the Tibetan highlands is not easily available, but from what I have been able to gather so far, one of the missions, maybe one of the most important missions, the China Inland Mission, has produced a report of the missionaries sent to Tibetan areas before the 1950s. And as you can see here on the chart, this mission only had 9 Canadian missionaries, 3 male and 6 female. There have been other missionaries in Darjeeling, in Kalimpong, in Bhutan, but that's a whole presentation topic on its own. Let me introduce to you two that I consider maybe the most important missionaries. The first one is a lady born in 1968, Susie Carson. She was born in Chatham, Ontario, and was trained in the late 19th century as a medical doctor. In the late mid 1890s, she met a Dutch person, Petrus Reinhardt, so that's her married name, who had just come from China, where he was a missionary for the China Inland Mission. He talked about his experience to her, married, and then he persuaded her to go back to China. And eventually, they actually wanted to be more in relation with Tibetans. And their explicit aim was to go to Lhasa together. Very important here, they were independent missionaries. That means that actually they were more like loose cannons and adventurers roaming the plateau rather than actively trying to convert people. She has written her memoirs with the Tibetans in Tent and Temple, where she talks a lot about the Golok people, but not only, about this extraordinary journey, actually a very tragic one, where she lost her baby first, and then she lost her husband. Here you see the bend, north of Lhasa, where he was killed by bandits. And so she was diverted and eventually arrived more than a year later in Batang, where she remarried with another missionary. And I think he's British or Scot, I don't remember, James Moyes, who was part of the Disciples of Christ mission. She came back to Canada. She was very ill, and then she unfortunately passed away quite early. The second missionary is also from Disciples of Christ, Roderick MacLeod, born in Prince Edward Island, and went to study religion at Yale University, where he met his wife.
As well, so I think there would be already.
So both of them were part of the Disciples of Christ mission in Batang. So this is not him on the picture, that's his pastor. His mission was bilingual, Tibetan and Chinese. So judging by the name, this pastor here may have been Chinese, but, and also the dress, but we never know. So this is the mission of Batang a little bit after he left. He didn't write his memoirs. He wrote very succinct reports of his missions and the converts over there, but it is still a contribution. In my eyes, the most important traveler to Tibet in pre-1950s time is the journalist Archibald Steele, who was born in Toronto but moved with his family quite early to the USA. He was quite a famous journalist and won many awards during his long career. He was sent to China as the war correspondent for United Press. So he wrote a lot of articles for the New York Times, the Chicago Daily News, the New York Herald Tribune, and he was one of the main Western journalists covering the Nanjing Massacre and the China-Japan War. He traveled to Kumbum in 1939 to take this picture, which is believed to be the first ever picture of the Dalai Lama. And he went to follow him, if you want, or he went to Lhasa in 1944. And at the very end of his life, he wrote a book of memoirs in the kingdom of the Dalai Lama. And the picture is taken from this book. So do these travelers really influence the emergence of Tibetan studies in Canada? Probably not. I'm not sure how much you have heard about them, but I hadn't heard about them before preparing this talk. How about now engaged Buddhists and sympathizers? Do we have in Canada icons a little bit like Richard Gere, for example, who would have, invested both the religious and the political activist front to bring awareness, so to speak, on Tibetan issues? Here we have musicians, singers, and also actors for Keanu Reeves, probably not involved so much in the public sphere about Tibetan issues. As for engaged sympathizers, I found mostly two. One of them is Victor Chan, born in Hong Kong, but then settled in British Columbia. He met with the Dalai Lama in 1972, and from Kathmandu, where he was based, he did frequent travels to Tibet and wrote this massive, huge guidebook, the Tibet Handbook, which I believe most of us have used in our journeys over there. He's been a very active member of various pro-Tibet groups. He organized the coming of the Dalai Lama to Vancouver at least once, maybe more than once. Another engaged sympathizer is documentary author and author Michael Buckley, who wrote and shot the film, both Meltdown in Tibet, on the geopolitics of Tibetan or highland Asia water. And he also wrote a few tourist guides about Tibet. How about now the Tibetan diaspora in Canada? How have they been in relation with academics? Or actually, I should say, how have they themselves become outstanding academics? So I see mostly three waves of Tibetan migration to Canada. The first one started as a thought in the 1960s, where the UNHCR reached out to Canada to create a refugee settlement program. So this took a lot of back and forth, and the Dalai Lama himself made a personal appeal to the Canadian Prime Minister, Lester Pearson. So it became a reality a few years later. End of 1970, beginning of 1971, you see here Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so the father of the current one, who welcomed 60 families, 240 Tibetans to Canada at that time. What is really significant is that this was a pilot project. It was the first project explicitly welcoming political refugees, so refugees in Canada, and was thought to be a model for a subsequent refugee coming to the country. There was quite a lot of screening, which actually unsettled a few Tibetans. First of all, Canadians wished to have Tibetans having a surname. It is a little bit more popular in Kham than in other areas of Tibet because it did fit with bureaucratic rules. Some of them came without a surname, but it was kind of a criterion. They wanted young Tibetans, of course, for the work force, with some level of education and in line with Canada's labor needs, in particular with the farms. The first thought was to disperse all of the Tibetans across the whole country so that they wouldn't form, so to speak, a ghetto. But actually, this idea was abandoned quite early because they understood that it would just not work with the communities. So each group, actually, they sort of grouped together, not strictly along religious lineages, but there is a tendency to have seen similar lineages gather around. So for the Sakya lineage in Calgary in Alberta, the Nyingma in Winnipeg, but nowadays there are very few Tibetans left in Manitoba, the Kagyu in Lindsay, Ontario, close to Toronto, and the Geluk lineage near Montreal. This TISEM is a very significant oral history project about writing down the story of those first wave Tibetan Canadians. So it's been set up by a few Tibetan Canadians, but mostly Diki Chuyang and Ringnam Mwangkang, whom I will talk about in a minute. It's a very important project that is both a website and very soon a book in English and in French, and it will probably set a mark on writing the history of that part of immigration into Canada. Two pictures to allude to this part of history. This one first arriving in Quebec. This one first arriving in Alberta quickly after. Second wave of migration now, which is probably the one that most of you are familiar with in the mid to late 1990s, in the wave of the Tibetan US resettlement program, many Tibetans also came to North America, yes, but mostly Canada, and in Canada, mostly Toronto. So this is like a quantitative migration, and gradually they constituted Little Tibet in Parkdale in one area of Toronto. But then in 2013, third wave of migration after His Dalai Lama's request, His Holiness Dalai Lama's request to the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper, 2,000 Tibetans resettled from the Arunachal Pradesh region. So when we look at official figures, we see here in the 2021 Canadian census, when I chose the ethnic and cultural origin of the population, so the self-described Tibetans account for 9,350, which is a little bit lower than what I had expected. And as you can see, most of them are in Ontario and especially in Toronto, also in Alberta, a little bit in British Columbia, and also in Quebec province. So I've given you other figures here of the Nepali. I've also tried Bhutanese, but it did not appear in the census. Also Mongolian, to give you a sense of proportions compared with Indian and Chinese. Maybe some of the Tibetans, crossed their box maybe closer to Indian if they were from Ladakh, for example, or Nepali if they were from northern Nepal. We need to interpret those figures to have maybe a clearer idea of how many cultural Tibetans there are in Canada. What is very striking about the Tibetans in Canada is that they have been very involved in campaigns, activism, community building, and bringing awareness about Tibetan issues, not only in Canada, but on the global scene. Through, for example, the Canada-Tibet Committee, founded by Thupten Samdrup and Carol Samdrup in the late 1980s, they organized and pioneered many campaigns, invited the Dalai Lama a few times, who opened to indigenous peoples here in Canada. And actually, probably he's the most famous Tibetan Canadian, since he received honorary Canadian citizenship in 2006, an honor that is only shared with 5 other people. As you can see here, the Swedish person who saved many Jews during the World War II, Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, although it was revoked, Prince Aga Khan, and Malala Yousafzai. But talking about Tibetan Canadians who live in Canada, one cannot pass or one cannot forget the legacy of this extraordinary family, the Rabgye family from Lindsay, Ontario, who have received very recently, I think a few months ago, the Meritorious Service Cross. So it's the highest civilian recognition, and the medal. So they got both of them, which is extremely rare, from the Governor General of Canada in Ontario. So you have here Punsel Rabgye and his wife, and then their fantastic 2 daughters. They received this recognition for the exceptional deeds that they did for Canada, but also bringing cross-cultural understanding by being very involved community-wise, both in Canada and in Tibet. So here are the 2 exceptional Rabgye sisters, first generation university graduates. Both of them achieved the highest possible degrees with very prestigious scholarships, both of them with PhDs. So Losang Rabgye in gender and anthropology from SOAS, and Tashi Rabgye from anthropology, University of Harvard, a little bit later. They received many awards. On Lobsang Rabgye's side, she's the first Tibetan Commonwealth scholar and also the first National Geographic emerging explorer from Tibet, whereas her sister Tashi Rabgye was the first Tibetan Rhodes scholar in 1991, which allowed her to study law at Oxford and Cambridge universities. She did a LLM in international public law, and then did advanced studies in comparative Chinese law, where she compared the situation of Taiwan and Tibet, and has been a fellow for the Public Intellectuals Program on the National Committee of US-China Relations for a few years in the 2010s. So both of them have been named by Harvard Law School Women Inspiring Change, as it was also a recognition given to Stacey Abrams, Sonia Sotomayor, Kamala Harris, or Kimberly Crenshaw. So this is truly extraordinary and inspiring. In 2006, they founded Machik, who is which is an NGO that skillfully shuns issues that are either political or religious and focuses instead on community programs, especially education, health, and yeah, education, health, traditional handicrafts, and so on. So they have fostered a few dozen children who are now fully educated and professionals within Tibet. Another outstanding member of the Tibetan-Canadian diaspora is Diki Choyan, this time from Montreal, although she was born in India but came as a young child to Canada. She also pursued very high studies, an MA, I believe, with Elliot Sperling at Indiana University at the Central of Eurasian Studies, where she studied, including fieldwork, higher education in Qinghai in the Tibetan language. She also did a second MSc program at Guelph. She's been involved in a number of community programs. She's really one of the, I'd say, visible members of the Tibetan diaspora in Canada. She ran for parliament, Tibetan parliament in exile. She won the seat for North America in 2011 and was then invited to become the foreign minister, so of the Department of Information and International Relations in the Kashak from 2011 to 2016. Then she came back to Canada and was involved in more community projects, the latest one being Chisem, that I talked about later. And she's been involved lately in McGill University's Indigenous Initiative. I underline here the word indigenous because I think it's a recurring feature that is worth keeping in mind. Tladrun Tenton now, she's the daughter of a famous politician T.C. Tenton, who unfortunately passed away very, very recently, and a Canadian mother. This time she's born in Vancouver, so you see we have all areas of Canada covered. And she's, of course, well known for founding SFT and 10 years later, the Tibet Action Institute, which are heavily involved in activism and bringing awareness programs, especially lately about the colonial boarding schools in the PRC. Other young, striking Tibetan Canadians are politician Butila Karpache, the first Tibetan MP elected in North America for the Ontario province jurisdiction. In 2020, she proposed, and it was accepted, it was voted, the Bill 131, which recognizes July as Tibetan Heritage Month in Ontario every year. We also have Tsering Yangzom Lama, whose book, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, attracted a lot of attention from the literary world last year. She was born in Nepal, moved to Toronto with her family, studied in the US, came back, and I believe now she's living in the Vancouver area. So she studied creative writing, and as you can see, her book was shortlisted for quite a few prestigious prizes. A little bit younger, Ringnam Wangkang, born in Toronto. He's an award-winning journalist, joined the CBC, and now he's involved with community production and producing at CBC, and he's the co-founder of the Chisem project. Let us not forget absolutely outstanding young academics. The principal at the Tibetan Cultural Center in Etobicoke is Dechen Dorje, who's highly trained in Tibetan linguistics and Buddhist epistemology, as you can see here from his degrees from the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. We, of course, have Riga Shakya, who has given us the GRITH, at least 2 lectures now, born in London, but grew up part of his life in Vancouver, who just completed last year a PhD at Columbia University. From an aristocrat's autobiography, he developed skills in Qing history, intellectual and political history, poetics in the 18th century. But he's also heavily involved in Tibetan culture today. He knows everybody all across the plateau and is involved in film and film criticism as well. And then slightly younger, Kandro Langri, born in the mid-1990s, Montreal side, studies anthropology, finished her MSc at Oxford, and now is doing her PhD at Stanford, another Ivy League, on early exile, especially road construction workers, the oral history of them and their imagination of belonging. She's also an award-winning poet. So when do they have time to do all of these things? So her family name may not have been, of course, lost on you, since she's the daughter of probably one of the most important Tibetan-Canadian academic, Geshe Thupten Jinpa Langri, born in Tibet, but did his degree, so the highest degree, Geshe Larampa, in Ganden Monastery, and became in the late 1980s the main English translator of the Dalai Lama. He founded the Institute of Tibetan Classics in Montreal and has mentored quite a few, at least 2 that I can think of, scholars who are now professors, Lara Breitstein and Philippe Turenne. So the excellency of Tibetan's own scholarly tradition are, of course, extremely important in the shaping of Tibetan studies. So I asked myself, has there any role being played by temples? Like, have any of these academics been trained in monastic institutions or religious centers here in Canada? So I believe, as far as monasteries are concerned, there's 2 monasteries here, but there are, of course, many religious centers. I've only put here those from Quebec province because I believe most of you may not be familiar with those. And the one that I highlighted here, the Centre Buddhiste Manjushri, is the one where Nicolas Tessier, so his Tibetan name is Tenzin Norbu, has first studied his religious basics, if you want. And he decided to devote his life to becoming a monk and even going all the way for the Geshe degree. So he's been for, I think, 16 or 17 years in Bilakupe, and he should be close to graduating from the Geshe degree very soon. So as you see, there is, of course, this huge Tibetan tradition of studies and religion and history, but in this case, religion, that is also important, but somehow did not percolate too much through our academic system, except for through Thupten Jinpa's ways. So here I've tried to list out the most important studies about Tibetan diaspora in Canada from a social science, if you will, perspective. So in light gray are the MA thesis, and in dark gray, the PhD dissertation. So as you can see, there's about 8 MA theses, starting from Janet McLellan in Toronto, Lindsay actually, and in Quebec province, we have Jane Gardner and Luc Cormier, who looked at the Tibetan diaspora over there. So it's mostly, as you can see, Toronto and even Jeffrey Kupchik working with a local Tibetan master on a Buddhist ritual, music ritual tradition. So it's mostly about identity, about reshaping life. Then we have Jennifer Logan on, again, Parkdale, Toronto, another ethnomusicologist, again in Toronto. Marc Desjardins, the only one in this list that I could see on Tibetan religious practices in British Columbia, and all the rest, Toronto, as far as I can see. And one of them, PhD in, actually a recent one, Eliza von Bayer, on the Tibetan women in Ottawa. So the later, if you will, researchers, Anne-Sophie Benz, who is here with us today, are about the political activism of the diaspora in Toronto, and also Carol McGranahan a few years later on comparing forms of activism across different cities. So I'm sorry to be so quick, but we really have to move now towards the academics. So before we speak about Tibetan studies in the humanities, let's first have a very quick look at hard, so to speak, sciences, because we are not the only ones to do fieldwork in Tibet and to research Tibetan issues, but from other angles. So we have, first of all, geologists. So these are just names, the ones that I could find and who have produced articles about Tibet or various aspects about Tibetan geology, Tibet's geology, including glacier collapse, as you can see here. More glaciologists with different aspects to their skills, glacial hydrology, and also atmospheric physics. We have here at the University of Toronto somebody looking at high altitude physiology. How does the body change whilst climbing Mount Everest? Some fieldwork are very adventurous and interesting, as you can see. We have biologists, especially judging by their names, coming from the PRC, looking at the molecular aspects, biology aspects of barley, or looking at fish, for example, in the Qinghai Lake, and their physiological and biochemical adaptation with the high alkalinity, for example, of that lake. Again, here in sustainable resource management, we have another scholar from Newfoundland looking at peat, especially carbon and nitrogen cycling in the ecosystems over there. And the last two that I will mention here are probably the most famous among you. We have Mark Foggin in conservation biology. He's the son. And the next one is his father. So he's connected with the University of British Columbia. He's been involved with nomadic pastoralism and especially resource management and horizontal policy analysis. He was known as the director of the NGO Plateau Perspectives, who did some work in Qinghai in the 2000s. And his father here is a medical geographer, Peter Foggin, who was born in China and who kept going back to China and having important connections, academic connections over there. His long-term interest is in nomadic herding, both in Mongolia and in the Miao people, but also in, according to his website, what he calls Southern Qinghai, so probably the Golok. And he mentored one student, but I have not been able to find his or MA or PhD so far, but I know he mentored Luc Fournier. So as you can see, we're not the only ones, but let's try and see what or how the field shaped up, if you will, in Canada. So it seems to me, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that it started with the German Buddhologist Herbert Günther, who in 1964 moved to the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. And whilst he trained two important and very well-known Canadian students, he's also well-known for his writings, especially The Life and Teaching of Naropa, of course, and the tantric view of life. So basically studies about Indo-Tibetan tantrism, philosophy, psychology, tantra, etc. So his first student, Leslie Kawamura, was a professor in Buddhist studies at the University of Calgary and wrote, as you can see here, on the Bodhisattva doctrine and on religion and ethnicity. Whilst his other famous student is Leonard van der Kuyp, who was actually born in Holland. So this is the little section of my presentation where I have 3 Dutch Canadians. And then after his MA, moved to Hamburg with Schmidhausen to do his PhD, and spent 5 years in Kathmandu in the German manuscript preservation project. He's of course extremely well known, and he trained some of the, at least one of them, Rory Lindsay, scholars that we have here in Canada. He's a walking encyclopedia of Tibetan Buddhist literature. He co-founded with Jean Smith the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, and is of course extremely well known throughout his production on Indo-Tibetan Buddhist intellectual history, in transmission of culture, epistemology, philosophy, and especially around the Sakya, so Mongol period. Another Dutch Canadian is Tom Tillemans, who was born in Holland, but then moved to BC to do his BA and MA, and later moved on to become a professor of Buddhist studies at the Université de Lausanne in Switzerland. So he's also a very prolific writer, especially of books, but also many articles. As you can see here, he's very interested in logic, in Dharmakriti, so various tantras and texts that he translated and annotated, and he also supervised a few prominent researchers and scholars. So the third Dutch Canadian that I wish to talk about here is Ardi Verhagen, also born in Holland, originally a physiotherapist. After he migrated to Canada, he started studies in history and went to the PhD level and completed his PhD in 1998 at the University of Waterloo on the Dalai Lamas. As you can see here, it's become a book, and he has since been a part-time professor at the Esalen Institute in California. So let me take a little break here. So still continuing now on the Canadians that have been shining abroad, let's say, who didn't stay in Canada. We have here one of the most famous names for Tibetan Buddhist art history, Jeff Watt, who became a monk at the young age of 17 and a student of Deshung Rinpoche in Seattle. He founded in 1998 the Himalayan Art Resources that probably everybody here knows. It's a massive resource for anything dealing with Tibetan classical Buddhic art, over 60,000 images that are commented upon. He's also famous for having been Rubin Museum's first curator, or actually the conceiver, the founder, if you want, of the collections of the Rubin Museum. And since then, he has retired. Another Canadian that was shining outside of Canada was Glenn Mullen, who's an Anglophone Quebecer. He studied, as you can see here, with quite a lot of masters. This is available from his website, mostly in the Gelug tradition, as you can see, but he's also received teachings and empowerments from the other lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. He founded in 1984 the Mystical Arts of Tibet, where he set, a few monks on tour in the West, performing Tibetan Buddhist rituals, the most famous or spectacular ones, if you will, being the sand mandalas, but also music, for example, the deep voice music and maybe dance, but I'm not sure that he organized cham tours in the West. He's also a very prolific writer, as you can see here, just a few copies. He also collaborated both with Jeff Watt, as you can see, with Heather Stoddard, and did a lot of translations on the various Dalai Lamas, the successive Dalai Lamas. From one Mullen to another Mullen now, so their names are very close, although they're of course not related. James Mullins, maybe born around the same period. He's a retired professor of religious studies at the University of Saskatchewan, so where Herbert Günther was before. And from his the information I could gather on the web, there seems to be many stories here, as with everyone I talked about so far, where he says that he acted briefly as a bodyguard for the Dalai Lama. So as a scholar, he was interested in comparative religion. So he also looked at life on a kibbutz, for example, in Israel, and also indigenous religions. He was involved in First Nations efforts to preserve their culture. So here again, we see a recurrent interest with indigenous studies. Another scholar who's retired, but this time in anthropology, is Marcia Kalkowski, who studied for both MA and PhD at UBC and taught anthropology for a few decades at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan. She worked a lot on Tibetan healing, ritual, performance, and she's sharing her life, as you can see here, with Sonam Tashi, a very famous ex-TIPA performer, very involved in the documentation of performing arts history. He did several documentaries. Later in her career, she herself also opened comparative research with Indigenous healers here in Canada. So now, still in the social sciences, another retired professor and another one who contributed with a very significant book, Circle of Protest, in 1995. He was a professor of sociology at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And this book is a landmark in analyzing ritual, but also politics in contemporary Tibet. And he also co-edited with Robbie Barnett what is probably the seminal book on trying to understand modernity in a Tibetan context, or modernities, with all of their diversity and alternatives. Still on the east coast of Canada, this time in New Brunswick at the University of Dalhousie, Christopher Helland, also sociologist, this time of religion. He's very interested in the mobilization of digital technology in religious activities and rituals. So he documented the use of internet and media technologies on the Kala Chakra initiation, for example. He's very interested more widely in Tibetan digital diaspora. He's got his own website, virtualtibet.ca, and he wrote a book, Virtual Religion, a case study of virtual Tibet, where he collaborates with monks trying to understand what is the impact of digital technology on their practices. So now more towards textual studies and in religious studies, we have James Apple, professor at the University of Calgary, who wrote a few books here about, as you can see, Tsongkhapa and Atisha, who I believe may be American, judging by his MA and BA, but I am not too sure. And now finishing this section on other Canadians who have been shining abroad, I'd like to mention three more people. The first one, Andrew Fisher, we will be very happy to listen to his lecture that he's kindly agreed to give here on the 17th of April. originally from Toronto, let's say, but based really in Montreal. He's an economist. He's one of the rare people who can actually make statistics speak and interpret them in all of their implications, including what they do not say or intended to say. So he first studied development economy and demography, and then went on to spend 7 years amongst Tibetans in exile. He's absolutely fluent in Tibetan. Then after his PhD, and when he was a professor, he spent 2 more years in Amdo and Western China. So his books are absolute landmarks to understand the current marginalization of Tibetans within the PRC from an economic and economico-political perspective. And he's now a professor at the Institute of Social Studies in Rotterdam. So do not miss his lecture on the 17th of April. It will be about the 2020 census in Tibet and how do we have to understand population shifts. Another Canadian shining outside is Anna Balixi. Denjongpa is her married name, from Swiss and Montreal both. She achieved her PhD in SOAS about village religion, so to speak, in Sikkim. She's a prominent member of the Namgyel Institute of Tibetology and the editor of the Bulletin of Tibetology. And since 2022, 22, she developed a research partnership with Frances Garrett about Sikkim and religion in Sikkim. And finally, the last one I'd like to mention to you is Elijah Ari, or Tenzin Sherap is his Tibetan name, or Jatse Chulku. He's very well known for being a Western reincarnation of a Tibetan Lama, Geshe Gyatso. He profusely wrote about it in his autobiography in French, in at least one academic article, and he's not shy of giving his time to several documentary makers about his experience. So it's a very solid account of what it means to be a Western Tulku. He studied at Sera Monastery for 6 years and then went on to complete a PhD at Harvard on Jesun Choki Gyaltsen Ascension and the secret biography of Kedrup Gelek Belzan. Now he lives in Paris, where he does not identify as a monk anymore and is more a meditation teacher and a therapist, Gestalt therapist. So this was my first part, where I conceive of 2 main periods of the development of Tibetan studies in Canada. The first part, as you saw, were implied non-Canadians coming to Canada to teach Tibetan studies, or Tibetans going abroad and then training, but also teaching abroad. This now here is what I would call a second phase of Tibetan studies in Canada, which came after the very important hires of several key scholars in at least 2 institutions, UBC and University of Toronto. And from there, the fact that these people were together, they could build a synergy, so to speak, and then they could actually build structurally to amplify the importance of Tibetan studies, I believe, in their respective institutions. So in Vancouver, we see Tsering Shakya's hire in 2006, followed by those of Sarah Schneiderman, Mark Turin, all fantastic, very influential people in their own fields. And in 2015, they created the Himalaya program. I will speak about funding in a little while, and then the last recruit being Pasanyangji Sherpa. So we see here a focus on history, anthropology, a lot of collaborative work with Mark and Sarah, more on Nepal than Tibet. But they can also extend, they supervise Tibetan students. And with Pasanyangji Sherpa, issues about climate change, relationship to the environment, and empowerment of local communities. At the University of Toronto, since the recruitment of Frances Garrett in 2003, I see and the amazing dynamism and the multiplicity of projects that she's been having there in collaboration with Columbia University, for example. There is now presently at University of Toronto a massive amount of textual and resources. The library is probably one of the top richest libraries with Tibetan texts in North America. So in 2016, we have here, the Robert Ho Family Foundation getting in to support the Center for Buddhist Studies, to support a postdoc, which we will hear about next week, and to support Tibetan studies there. At UBC, it was more the Khyentse Foundation. I'm not aware of the amount and level of funding that the two institutions receive, but we can see some external, at least help or consolidation being crucial to recruit postdocs and make Tibetan studies more visible in these areas. Also at UBC, part of the Himalayan program is their speaker series, I believe once a month, which is hugely important. They have a lot of intellectuals. They work very much in a decolonial perspective with lots of local intellectuals. And they are very open also to working with indigenous people and on indigenous studies, especially Mark Turin among his projects. So the University of Toronto, in comparison, looks a little bit more like the solid traditional Buddhist textual studies approach, if you want, with Frances and then the new recruit, Rory, who we will hear in a few weeks in this lecture series. Whereas in Montreal, there is no one institution. It's actually multiple institutions. So we are 5 professors at the GRITH who have been hired more or less at the same time. And in 2019, so more or less at the same time as the 2 other institutions, we came together and founded the GRITH. So this will be the end of my talk in just 2 or 3 minutes. So we also received funding from an external source, but this time it's not a foundation or religiously based, if you want, or Tibetan or Asian-based foundation. It's the Quebec Province Fund for Scientific Research, and our funding is coming to an end next year. So as you can see from the main page of the Himalaya program, there are 22 faculty which are affiliated with this program. This is huge. And so in the steering committee, there are 5 people, of course, famous historian, probably the most famous Tibetan historian in the West, Tsering Shakya, very influential book, Dragonland of Snows. His interest ranges from history, literature, and he's been able to, attract some interest. And then Mark and Sarah, post-earthquake reconstruction, construction of identity among the Thami people, more linguistic for Mark, more social anthropology for Sarah, a lot of collaboration with local scholars. Likewise, Pasang Nyanti Sherpa, climate change, and also she is a professor. She has a double appointment with Indigenous Studies at UBC. They have trained a lot of people, but somehow I was surprised by the number of Tibetan graduates that have been obtaining their degrees from UBC. So on the left here, you have 3 Tibetan MA graduates. We will hear about the Mriti in a few weeks. So one about sociolinguistic migrants, aspect or perspective on migrants in Toronto, one on the reconstruction of the Karma Kagyu tradition in exile, and Tsering Yangdzom Lama on creative writing. And the other ones are more doing a PhD, although the second one, Rekjong Tönjuptashi, is doing his PhD at Northwestern University, but he does his MA at UBC. So Tashi Tsering, who will have the pleasure to listen to in 2 weeks' time on very important issues of water management and politics, especially with what is going on in Kham at the moment. He got his PhD in resource, environment, and sustainability, and studied social inequality and resource management in Piti. And he's now a lecturer at Mount Royal University in Calgary. So Rekjong Tönjuptashi is studying autobiographies, including of the Dalai Lama, the current one, and writings of 20th century intellectuals. And then Tsering Djurkar, who just completed, I believe, her PhD in social work about kinship-based social help organizations among the Tibetan diaspora. And then Bendi Tso, I believe she uses more her Tibetan name now, in anthropology with Sarah Schneiderman, looking at very sophisticated and understanding of identity construction in the Sino-Tibetan borderlands. So looking at how some aspects may be essentialized and some aspects are more strategic in negotiating identity. She's now carrying out her postdoc at Stanford University. So let us not forget the other academics in BC, at least those that I know, and two of them have graciously accepted to be part of our series in a few weeks. First, Shannon Ward, who's a professor of community culture and global studies at UBC Okanagan. She is going to release very soon, I think in a few weeks or in a few months, her ethnography, Amdo Lullaby, an ethnography of childhood and language shift on the Tibetan plateau. She's a linguistic anthropologist, works with children, as you can see, language acquisition, and works with both Chinese and Amdo Tibetan. Then we have the philosopher, Nick Bonmarito, who lived in Lhasa for studied Tibetan there for, I think, 2 years, and looked at philosophical questions like virtue ethics, moral psychology, and Buddhist philosophy in Tibetan Buddhism. And then Rupak Shrestha, who will be with us in a few weeks, is a Nepali looking at Tibetan refugees in Nepal, and especially issues of borders, belongings, indigeneity, and more recently, security and surveillance. So I'm sorry this is all so fast. I hope I don't misrepresent all of you, but I'm happy that you will be able to talk for yourself. So Toronto here, as I said, more textual Buddhist studies with 4 main professors that I could see. Francis, with a wide range of interest and projects over the last 20 years, started with an interest in medical theories, especially embryos. You see her book here, but Indo-Tibetan Tantrism, Gesar, where she worked in collaboration with communities in Amdo, and now Sikkim, where she looks at a religious practice over there. She's very interested in healing, Buddhism, and also pedagogy, how to teach, how to equip our students to let them flourish. Rory, who will be with us very soon, also on the 8th of May, Canadian but trained at Harvard, the editor, or one of the editors of 84,000, translating the words of the Buddha, who just released, like literally a few days ago, I believe, his book on funerary, so saying the dead, funerary rituals, and this Tantra. And then Jayita Sharma, originally from Assam, professor in the Department of History and Cultural Studies, who works more on migration, cultural circulation in the Eastern Himalayas, especially looking at it from a post-colonial perspective, looking at effects of the British Empire. And then Sarah Aoife Richardson, who did her PhD with Francis, I believe, who's now a professor in the Department of History, specialist, of course, of the Chalut murals, a historian of art, interested in visual material practice and painting. And next week, we will welcome Michael Hume, who's a postdoc at University of Toronto, who's been interested not only in Gelug history and doctrine, but also the topic of his talk, material culture, so the self-emanated, the Rangjun carvings on the walls. So on the rocks. Then some Tibetan graduates, like I did for UBC, I could see Kempo Kunga Sherap, who is also the language instructor at U of T, did both his MA and PhD there, especially on the Chulko system. Then we have two ladies, Tenzin Sunju and Kiki Doma Bhutia, Sikkimese, who went on to do her PhD in Estonia and Tartu, and then in the ongoing PhD of Chinle Gyatso. Other academics in Ontario include Karine Gagné, who did her PhD in anthropology at Montreal, who wrote the wonderful and award-winning book Caring for Glaciers, about climate change and glacier melting in Ladakh, animal-human relations. And now she's moving more towards understanding infrastructures. Angela Sumegi from Carleton on the interface between Buddhism and shamanism, with her book here. Tracy Jiang, who's a professor in communication and media studies at York, who actually did her PhD about Tibetan carpet weavers in Lhasa. And she also gave us a talk at GRITH a few years ago. Still in the Toronto area, Jeff Kopchik, who is an ethnomusicologist. He tried to bridge Buddhist studies, ritual studies, with the aesthetic study of music from an experiential point of view. He studies a lot the relationship between music and well-being, Buddhism and pop music, also mega concerts. His book came out last month, and so we're very happy because he showed interest in sharing the results and the research results of his books with us this fall. And then last but not least, Diallo, originally from Amdo, Urtsu or Labrang area, who did a PhD in education and then went on to become a professor in Yunnan, and then came back to Canada to become, I believe you all have heard of him, an activist, an advocate against the boarding school system for Tibetans in the PRC, and he's spoken at the US Congress and other fora for his hearing. So this is us, the GRITH. As we can see, we are 6 people, including Geshe Tutenjimbala. The 5 other ones are from 5 different universities, some in French, some in English. So recruiting students is quite difficult when we come from the French background. Lara Braystein is, of course, well known for her study of Indo-Tibetan Tantrism and Buddhism, and her studies of autobiographies and gur, especially of Saraha, and also more recently the biographies of the 10th Shamarpa. Marc Desjardins is more involved in Bön studies, collaborates internationally on a big project to find to first decipher and translate a massive corpus of texts about Bön, tries to find the origins of Bön and possible cultural influences on early Bön. And then my 2 other colleagues, John Levitt, is specialized on Northern India, Uttarakhand, on especially poetics, orality, and my dear friend and colleague, Chiara Letizia, works on Nepal, on secularization, especially in the court system, among other very diverse projects. I'm seeing here the time is running, and I don't want to keep you waiting because I know you're very busy at this time of the year. So just a few words about our associate members. Ornella Puskiasis will join us on the 24th of April. She's researching Sherpa in between Nepal and New York, migration issues and patterns. And here on the right, Philippe Turenne, who was the principal of Rangjung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu for nearly a decade before he moved back to Canada. I shall close here by underlining the fundamental importance of Tibetan language instructors who are highly trained not only in Tibetan academic perspective, but also in the Western scholarly tradition. So they somehow juggle two hats, and I think it's quite exceptional to be able to rely on their expertise. So Sonam Chusang at UBC, Kempo Kunga Sherap at U of T, and Tsulchim Gurung Mriti at McGill. So you have two Kempos there who retrained themselves in the Western academic world. I'm just extremely happy that Mriti will share with us his research very soon. Sonam Chusang not only teaches Tibetan, produced a website to help with Tibetan language, but also shared poetry, his interest in poetry and contemporary intellectuals. So in closing, just a few dissertations that you may not be aware of because they were in Quebec province. So all of these MAs were done in French, except one in English, about Tibetans in Quebec, about the Tibetan political struggle, about Tibetans in Bir in India, about Tibetan medicine, Tibetan democracy, yogic songs, the relationship between Buddhism and Leonard Cohen, or infrastructure construction in Dolpo, northern Nepal. And then Yoel Bro and Estelle Brunet are finishing their MAs about a transdisciplinary artistic aesthetic apprehension of meditation through art, and museology for Estelle Brunet. PhD dissertations, so you just have a list here. As you can see, most of them, most of them in French. Two of them will be completed very soon, Matilda Perks and Mriti. I'm extremely happy and grateful that they will share their research with us. Then three of them, unfortunately, gave up the harsh writing phase, during the harsh writing phase of PhD writing. So we had Marie-Jo, who spent a few years among the pastoralists in Namdo. We had Maud Morin, who looked at the transnational networks of Tibetan families in Toronto. We had Adrien Mevus, who spent a few years on the teachings of the Kadampas. Unfortunately, this happens. It shows that, you know, it's still hard to finish that. So I will highlight that there's quite a lot of connections between graduates in the Quebec province and the Ramchung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu. Philippe was the ex-principal, but Lara teaches there regularly, and then Diane Denis and Julia Stenzel are there now teaching, and even I think one of them is director of research there. So thank you for your patience. I hope that I have been able to show that for Tibetan studies in Canada or by Canadians, it was a rather late blooming compared with Europe and USA. But it's very exciting what is going on at the moment. There's really a lot, and there's more to come because each scholar supervises more Tibetan students, Tibet study students. I shall underline here that although the Tibetan diaspora in Canada is a little bit tiny compared to others, you know, 10,000 people, although Toronto is a very important hub in the West for the Tibetan diaspora, it is an exceptional, extraordinary diaspora with tremendous achievements, both academically, as you've seen, highest degrees with and prestige, but also socially. It's a very community-minded, involved diaspora. There were two periods up until, let's say, Tsering Shakya's arrival and Francis Garrett's arrival in their institutions. Tibetan studies was shaped by scholars from abroad coming to Canada, or Canadians shining abroad, and also by a sense of fragmentation. So there was individuals trying to keep up their interest for Tibetan studies on their own with limited means across the whole country. Then for the last 15 years or so, there's kind of a clustering effect in 3 important hubs in the country. But each of us, we come with very different epistemological baggage because we've been trained in so many different places. So I think this adds to the richness. We do not find, I believe, specifically Canadian characteristics of Tibetan studies here. I believe we see the same sort of disciplinary divisions that we see in other parts of Western academia. So religion or Buddhism is probably still the strongest, let's say, aspect. Anthropology is also very important. And except for Tsering Shakya, history is a little bit less represented, as well as philology and literature or more secular aspects. I also hope to have shown that, which is very interesting, that both the Tibetans themselves in Canada and the academics regularly reach out with Indigenous communities or work with Indigenous issues to sort of complement their research. I'm not aware of this degree of involvement in other traditions, but I am not that informed, so I'm really willing to learn from you all. So this is what I had prepared, and I'm really grateful for your time, and really happy that you were able to join. And I'm sorry I was a bit long, but I tried to cut so many so many things. It's just so rich at the moment. So I'm sure I have left many things out, and feel free to inform me on people I forgot, issues I forgot, or other directions that would be worthwhile.
Thank you, Isabelle. I think it's hard to think what could you have forgotten, because it was so comprehensive and so so much information. But now, at least I'm speaking for myself, I learned a lot. So thank you. If anybody has questions, please feel free to jump and ask them. Otherwise, I can start. So if nobody is asking questions, then we have a few comments. Maybe Isabelle, you will read it later on. But for now, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that Canada Tibet Committee is very active, and I think you said that it's even more active than the Tibet movement in the United States. So is that true? I just wanted to clarify that, like, the Canadian movement is more active and is more, I don't know, profound that what they have like right next door.
I would not be able to speak for the last 30 years, because the Canada Tibet Committee was founded in 1987. I believe they were the first ones at that time. Nowadays, with demographic shifts in the Tibetan diaspora, with so many Tibetans in the United States, I am not able to say anything about what's happening there. I cannot be everywhere. I don't know, the amount of involvement and all the activities that they do online on the social media. We see actually quite a bit. The Canada Tibet Committee in the 1980s and 90s, they were responsible, for example, for creating the World Tibetan News, WTN, World Tibetan News, I think. So they compiled everything that was being said about Tibet, that was happening in Tibet, the new policies in Tibet. They were literally informing everyone that was interested in Tibet at the time. So I believe they were very influential and crucial at that time. So this needs to be followed up to the present time to see how the huge, so to speak, but by Tibetan standards, the demographic importance of Tibetans in the US, how this has shaped their activism.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to compare actually what is happening here and there. And is there any kind of I don't know, dissertation or work or book or an article that you would recommend that is that you would describe as most comprehensive in on Tibetan diaspora here in Canada, on the history of diaspora and so on?
I know I was very fast. I just flashed bibliographic references to you, but if you allow me, I will share my screen again and then come back here on the diaspora Tibetans. Sorry. Okay, it's here. So I have two slides here. We have a lot of MA and PhD dissertations, so they are unpublished, but they are incredibly rich. As far as publications are concerned, I think one article I found really helpful is Kandro Langri's encyclopedia introduction here. It's quite comprehensive and it's very useful. On the history of the Tibetan diaspora in Canada, I have not read these I only read Jeff Kopchick's, no, not that's his MA. He has a PhD also. I've read bits of his PhD, where he actually worked with a Tibetan master in Toronto that taught him the ritual. So here, this no, sorry. So oops, this one here, Jennifer Logan, is often quoted for the.
Well, I think it's not a PhD dissertation, it was a master dissertation that she wrote.
Oh, sorry. So who is speaking? Sorry, is it Anne-Sophie?
Yes.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember reading it, and it's quite short actually, and it's something like a I don't know, 60 or 100 pages, something like that. I think it was an MA dissertation. She didn't have time to do the PhD dissertation. I don't know if you know what happened to her, but she died in some kind of ritual.
Yeah, in the Amazon.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm sorry, I was mistaken there. Okay. So I have not read these. This one is the newest one. So I haven't read this one, but it's an arts-based inquiry. So basically, this is not my topic of research, okay? So I have been just hosting and trying to convene all the information. So I would start with these unpublished dissertations and then see.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone who wants to ask something? Michael?
Yeah, I mean, just thanks a lot. That was such a great presentation. I wonder if you can share the PowerPoint with us later. That might be helpful. But yeah, I'm just wondering, you talked about sort of cultures of Tibetan studies at different universities at U of T. I might say more, I don't know if conservative is the right word, but just kind of textual studies, and UBC with sort of indigenous focus. And I'm just wondering, do you have a sense why that might be the case? Is this just sort of different university cultures, or is there something in sort of provincial influences or politics, or in Quebec? Do you have a sense of why Tibetan studies has gone in these different directions?
Again, this is not the topic of my research. I tried to, I haven't delved really deeply into this. My hunch would be it's how do you say? It has to do with the profile of the people they hired. Tsering Shakya does not do textual Buddhist studies. the anthropologists, of course, it's not how they work. So they hired both Mark and Sarah, who don't do textual studies, and then Pasangyang Kicherpa doesn't do either. So I wouldn't go as far as somebody at UBC decided not to have that. I don't think that's how it worked. If they open up a assistant professorship position in Buddhist studies, for example, at UBC, and if you, of all people, or if anyone doing textual studies would get the job, I believe something of the sort would start to be happening there. I think it's contingent. Look at what happened at Boulder, for example, in Colorado, where all of a sudden they have 3 professors, 3 hires, all on Tibet, and then they set up the Himalaya Initiative, and then something picks up and something gets going. So I believe in synergy, people getting together over tea and saying, okay, what can we do together? Likewise, I don't believe that it was decided that Toronto should be more textual based. It just happened that way, and maybe the people who got those jobs really wanted that to happen, so really worked hard for that to come about.
Thank you.
That's my hunch. And so that's why we don't have such a clear image in Quebec, because we are scattered at 5 universities, overworked like all of us, but then getting together and starting to think, okay, let's do something together in 2 languages, with 1 historian, 1 religious studies, 3 anthropologists. It starts to become a little bit less coherent.
Rupak asks if it would be possible to share this presentation with everyone, what you showed us,
Yeah.
Since it is such an amazing source of information.
Yes, why not? So what would be the formula? We can either put it on the website, the GRITH website, or I'm not sure I can share it now with share the, can I share? No, oh yeah, I can share. How about if I put yeah,
in the chat?
in the chat? Yeah, but the video will be available anyway.
Yes.
So there is at least 1 trace of that. And maybe on top of the video, we'll put maybe the PowerPoint on the GRITH website. What do you think?
I think it's a good idea if you're ready to share it. And also, Isabelle suggested that we create our content on YouTube. So it will be, this lecture will be uploaded to our YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody else has questions? Otherwise, we can thank, oh, Michael, yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious. He mentioned, I mean, it was great to see the French language work that's been done. So does GRITH tend to collaborate more with scholars maybe in Europe who, in France, for example? Is there a sort of synergy there? I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, it's just so happens that both Chiara and myself, and also John Levitt, we were trained in France. And so it's not that we decide to collaborate because of the French language, it's because of our life paths. We happen to have friends, and some of them are here actually, friends and colleagues who are still working in France and who we are used to collaborate with. But you're right. I would like more Canadian collaboration. I would like to open up. What we actually have at GRITH is the usual academic discipline divide. Like, what common ground do I have with, for example, Lara, who does fantastic work on textual traditions, but we don't read the same books. We don't ask ourselves the same questions, but we both have a passion for Tibet. So how do we transform that into collaboration or something happening together? It just so happens that I have more in common with other people I have collaborated with before. So, but this needs to be done, I think, in order for us to be more visible and hopefully attract more students.
Thank you. Was there another question from Dashit Sitting or no?
Oh, hello. I just wanted to say, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Hello, Tashile.
thank you so much, Isabel. That was a wonderful presentation. It was so wonderful and enlightening to learn about this history and the breadth of people and of these luminous people doing work on Tibetan studies. So it was great. I just wanted to mention there is one study by Shauna McPherson, although the title does not mention anything about Tibet. It's on education and sustainability. And much of the research was done in Tibetan diaspora communities in Dharamsala and in Toronto. And I did some work for that. And so did my Tibetan colleague, Dawa Gosu, who you cited in her MA thesis. Yeah, that might be of interest because the question was raised earlier by Natalia. And I would like to see my PhD dissertation listed in yours list, especially because the study was done in Spiti Valley with a particular interest in the traditional Tibetan resource management practices and more from a social anthropological perspective. And there was one more thing I wanted to mention. Oh, yes. It was wonderful to see the attention about Canadian scholars as well as scientists doing work in Tibet. And I was wondering if your, how should I say, scope of research interest would include Tibetan-Canadian scientists who might not actually work, many of them actually have done work in Tibetan diaspora communities. So if I know this, including them would make your research topic quite unwieldy, but but that is definitely something that came up in my mind, and I just wanted to mention that. Other than that, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking at when I get my opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tashila, for this. Yes, I think that Siona McPherson collaborate with Anne-Sophie Benz on an article, an overview on Tibetan diaspora. But I didn't know this particular article. I will definitely look for it. As for your PhD, I'm really sorry. Actually, I did not forget it. What I chose to do in the PowerPoint, if I can share it here, yeah, is to try and find the works about the diaspora in Canada. And I naively thought that you dealt only with Spiti. So I said, okay, I have to, because otherwise there would be still many more. But you're right. Maybe I should have another document with all the Tibetan, all the PhDs about any Tibetan issue. That would be really worthwhile. And then for the Tibetan Canadian scientists, yes. How come I didn't even think that? Oh my God! Then I would need a research assistant to track it down because it already took a while to put together all these names. So yeah. But that's fabulous. As I said, the Tibetan Canadian diaspora is hugely achieving academically. It's just amazing what people are doing. Also in medicine. So it would be worthwhile, I think, to it could be actually a paper, like a research paper on academic success of the Tibetan diaspora of Canada, I believe. Okay, thank you for all of these references, Michael.
Yes, I was going to say that it's like Tibetan studies are happening now like your research is getting enriched with Michael's contribution, Tashit Serin's contribution, like it's all leveling up.
Yes, yes, I drink to that. Let's do that. Yes. Let's have some more every week.
And I think it would be great if you write a paper, like incorporate all this into Tibetan studies in Canada paper.
Yeah. When will I find the time? Yes. I agree. I agree. I think it's important to add Canada onto the list of national traditions that I talked about before.
Yes, you showed it, and it's like it's most of the work is already done. You presented it to us, so now it needs to be written.
Okay, if anybody wants to help, I would be happy.
Thanks to everyone for being here, for participating, for asking questions. Thanks a lot to Isabelle for supporting, once again, I'm saying, for supporting this idea and for navigating me to put this together. I'm very happy that we launched the spring season lecture series, and I think it was a great success. And next week on Wednesday, we have a presentation by Michael Ian, who will stream from University of Toronto, and who will be talking about Ganten Monastery's autogenous miracles, Ranjong, a study in Tibetan pilgrimage, material culture and discursive construction. And we are very much looking forward to continuing our lecture series and to hearing Michael.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Warm thank yous for being there, sticking around. Very much looking forward to next week and the next, which will be Tashit Sering's week. So this is launched. Now the boat is sailing, and I'm very happy that this is happening.
Me too. Me too. And I'm amazed. I'm really amazed that it's happening exactly today. Like when I'm here for 4 months, and it's happening. Okay. Thank you, and I wish everyone a nice Wednesday.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Have a good week. Bye bye. See you soon. And
Yeah,
get
bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.